In the grand palaces of old Britain, where stone corridors echoed like distant memory and candlelight trembled against carved walls, one truth felt almost impossible to modern eyes: royal children did not grow up beside their parents. They slept in different rooms, lived in separate wings, and often spent more time with appointed caretakers than with the kings and queens who brought them into the world. To outsiders, this distance may seem cold, even unthinkable. But in the centuries when monarchy shaped every heartbeat of the kingdom, separation was not cruelty. It was strategy, protection, and a carefully crafted tradition designed to create heirs who would belong not to a family, but to Britain itself. The first hours of a royal child's life already hinted at the path ahead. Their arrival was witnessed, documented, and supervised by a constellation of attendants who ensured that the infant who breathed in the first hush of palace air was unquestionably legitimate. From that moment forward, the child was no longer simply a son or daughter. They were a national investment, a figure whose future decisions would one day influence thousands, sometimes millions, of lives. And because their destiny was so vast, the monarchy believed that affection, however natural, must never interfere with responsibility. By the time a prince or princess reached their earliest years, a structure was already in place to shape them. A separate household, complete with nurses, governesses, assistants, and tutors, was created exclusively for the child. This system, known in Britain as the royal nursery, was its own world, governed by timings, rules, and rituals that seemed ancient even in their own era. Parents rarely entered this domain. In fact, many monarchs believed that frequent visits could disrupt discipline or weaken a future ruler's strength. And so children grew up surrounded by figures who cared for them professionally, rather than emotionally. These arrangements, to modern minds, sound distant, almost heartbreaking. But in the context of royal duty, they carried a reasoning that generations accepted. A monarch's life was not private. Every gesture, every decision, every mistake could shape national stability. A child raised in intimacy, the monarchy believed, might struggle to detach personal feeling from public duty. And so princes and princesses were trained early to maintain composure, to mask emotion, and to understand that tenderness could be a luxury for others, but not for them. Within the nursery, royal children learned structure before affection. Days were carved into lessons, meals, exercises, silence, and reflection. Compassion existed, but it was subtle, found in the calming voice of a nurse, a warm blanket tightened around small shoulders, or the gentle correction of a governess who knew how fragile a young heir could be beneath the weight of expectation. Yet even these caretakers were instructed to maintain distance. Too much closeness, court officials warned, could encourage dependence. And dependence, for a future monarch, was considered dangerous. Still, the emotional impact of this separation echoed throughout royal history. Letters from grown heirs hint at a quiet longing, a wish that childhood might have included more than responsibility and polish. Some described their early years as ordered or sheltered, while others quietly admitted to moments of loneliness. But they also acknowledged that this upbringing gave them something powerful: resilience. A sense of self stabilized not by affection, but by discipline. Tonight, as we step into this world of silence and structure, we explore not only why royal children lived apart from their parents, but how that distance shaped the rulers they later became. As the years unfolded, the separation between royal parents and their children became more structured, almost ritualized. The nursery was not merely a room, it was an entire world with its own hierarchy, unwritten rules, and quiet expectations. At its center stood the royal governess, a figure both respected and feared. She carried the responsibility of shaping a future monarch's mind, manners, and emotional restraint. Her authority often outweighed that of the parents themselves. Letters from royal households in the 18th and 19th centuries reveal that queens would politely request updates from the nursery rather than entering it without notice. Even kings approached with formality, as though crossing an invisible boundary between family affection and dynastic duty. Inside this carefully controlled world, childhood unfolded according to a schedule that seldom wavered. Days began early, with cold morning washes and lessons in posture, self-composure, and basic academics. Royal children learned to speak with clarity, to walk with measured grace, and to hold their emotions as tightly as their gloves during winter processions. The nursery staff monitored everything: cries, laughter, habits, and conversations, because every detail was believed to shape the character of the child who might one day rule millions. To modern eyes, this seems rigid, even distant. But to the royal court, it was a form of protection, shaping children into symbols the nation could trust. Meals were a lesson in discipline as much as nourishment. Food was simple, intentionally lacking indulgence, meant to teach restraint. Royal children were encouraged to eat quietly and without complaint, even when dishes were unfamiliar or served cool after long preparation rituals. Emotional expression at the table was discouraged. A future monarch needed to remain composed even during discomfort. The smallest breach in etiquette, a slouched back, a misplaced utensil, a burst of laughter, resulted in gentle correction. Over time, these corrections became instinct, forming a layer of self-control that followed them into adulthood. Yet the greatest impact of this upbringing was not the physical separation from their parents, it was the emotional distance that grew from it. Letters written by royal children during the Victorian and Edwardian eras often describe their parents with a sense of admiration, but also unfamiliarity. They saw them during scheduled visits, short windows framed by etiquette and observation. Hugs were rare, private moments rarer still. Parents were symbols to be honored, not companions to be held close. Even when affection existed, and it often did, it had to pass through the filter of royal formality. Despite this distance, the nursery was not devoid of warmth. Bonds formed within its walls, between children and their governesses, tutors, or footmen who became fixtures in their young lives. These individuals were the silent witnesses to royal childhoods. They tied shoelaces, soothed nightmares, encouraged hesitant first steps, and listened to whispered fears. Many royal children later admitted that the people who influenced them most deeply were not their parents, but the staff who lived beside them day after day. But this system, for all its strictness, carried a subtle contradiction. It was meant to prepare heirs for leadership, yet it also shielded them from the world they were destined to represent. Royal children grew up surrounded by polished floors, controlled voices, and curated experiences. Their first real encounter with the public, the noise, the expectations, the scrutiny, often arrived like a sudden storm. And it was in these early public appearances that the legacy of nursery life became visible: the impeccable posture, the careful smiles, the stillness learned over years of practiced composure. As the royal child grew into early adolescence, the distance between parents and heir widened in ways that outsiders rarely understood. Court diaries from the 18th and 19th centuries describe this period as a refinement of character, but in reality, it was a phase of controlled isolation. Daily life in the royal nursery shifted toward rigid discipline, monitored emotions, and an education shaped less by affection and more by duty. The child rose before dawn, dressed under the supervision of attendants, and moved through a schedule designed to cultivate restraint. Every gesture, every pause, every word was gently corrected. Even moments of silence were treated as lessons, practice for a future in which the monarch's calm could steady an entire nation. Around this age, children were introduced to the world of court politics, not through direct involvement but through carefully curated exposure. They were allowed to attend select meetings from behind half-closed doors or observe their parents in ceremonial settings from a quiet corner of the room. These glimpses were intentional. Royal parents believed that leadership was something absorbed long before it was exercised. The heir was taught to watch faces, understand tone, and sense the unspoken tensions that moved within the palace walls. Tutors later recalled that these years were meant to train not just the mind, but the instinct, teaching the heir to read a room long before they would learn to rule it. Letters from royal tutors reveal another dimension of this period: the emotional management expected of young heirs. Even natural feelings, frustration, excitement, fear, were quietly redirected into composure. Tears were discouraged, visible anger was considered a failure of discipline. Instead, children were guided towards self-containment, encouraged to resolve emotions privately and quickly. This was not cruelty but preparation. A monarch, they believed, could not afford public displays of vulnerability. And so, the nursery became the first place where the heir learned the art of appearing calm even when they were not. The physical distance between parents and child also deepened at this stage. While royal mothers and fathers did care for their children, affection was expressed differently than in ordinary families. A king or queen could not walk freely into the nursery without protocol. Visits were planned. Conversations were scheduled. Even a simple goodnight was often delivered through an attendant. Many heirs later wrote in their diaries that they longed for closeness, but understood why it could not be given. Their parents did not withhold love, they protected the monarchy through tradition. And tradition demanded emotional distance. During these years, children also transitioned from the nursery to formal schooling within the palace grounds. Lessons expanded to include languages, royal history, constitutional rules, and subtle forms of persuasion. They were taught how to speak with clarity, how to answer questions without revealing too much, and how to carry themselves during public ceremonies that awaited them. Behind every lesson was a reminder: the crown was not just inherited, it was practiced, shaped, and reinforced through behavior. Young heirs learned that the monarchy's strength did not rest on power alone, but on the perception of stability. Yet, despite the strictness of their environment, moments of genuine humanity still surfaced. Heirs often bonded closely with long-serving attendants, governesses, or tutors who offered steady presence in a world built on protocol. These adults were not family, but they became the closest thing to it. They witnessed the child's growth, worries, and triumphs. They offered quiet encouragement and private reassurance, emotional support that the royal system itself could not openly provide. Many heirs later credited these caregivers for teaching them compassion, resilience, and humility. By the time adolescence settled fully, the heir had already become a carefully shaped figure, balanced between childhood and responsibility, shaped by tradition yet reaching for independence. They understood that they were part of something larger than themselves, and that their life, though privileged, would never be entirely their own. The nursery might still have been their home, but it was no longer a place of innocence. It had become a training ground for a destiny they were only beginning to comprehend. As the young heirs crossed the threshold into early adulthood, the final transformation of their childhood unfolded quietly, almost symbolically. They were no longer shielded by the walls of the nursery or guided closely by governesses. Now they stood beside advisors, courtiers, and political tutors who shaped them with the expectation that one day the stability of a nation would depend on their judgment. Their days took on a new weight. Mornings began with briefings instead of lessons, and evenings ended with conversations about diplomacy, public perception, and the delicate balance between tradition and change. In these hours, they learned that the role waiting for them was not simply an inheritance, it was a responsibility built on centuries of expectation. Public duties became a larger part of their life. Each appearance required careful preparation. They practiced small gestures that the public would later interpret as warmth, confidence, or reassurance. They learned the subtle choreography of royal presence, how to acknowledge a crowd without appearing overwhelmed, how to listen with focus even when exhausted, how to remain poised under pressure. These skills were not theatrical, they were necessary. A moment of uncertainty could define a headline. A misplaced expression could be misread by observers who searched for meaning in every detail. For young adults still forming their own identity, this constant awareness was both exhausting and formative. Inside the palace, their relationships with parents evolved into something closer to mentorship. Royal mothers and fathers, once distant figures who visited the nursery on scheduled terms, now shared fragments of their personal experiences, mistakes they had made, pressures they had faced, moments when the weight of the crown felt too heavy. These conversations revealed a truth rarely seen by the public, that monarchs were human, shaped not only by duty but by fear, doubt, and private hopes. Yet even these intimate discussions carried formality, framed by the understanding that the heir's path was already set. Emotion had to coexist with discipline. Meanwhile, the young heirs continued to experience the limitations that had defined their entire upbringing. Friendships remained carefully curated, privacy was scarce, any personal ambition had to be weighed against public expectation. Even the joy of choosing their own future, career, hobbies, or relationships, was filtered through the demands of monarchy. Many royal heirs kept journals during these years, though every word was written with the awareness that history might one day read them. Their private thoughts were shaped by the same restraint that governed their public lives. And yet, moments of genuine humanity still found space to exist. A quiet walk at dusk through palace gardens could bring a sense of peace. A conversation with a trusted advisor could feel like a rare moment of honesty. A day spent visiting hospitals, charities, or rural communities could remind them why their role mattered. These experiences grounded the heirs, revealing that beneath the layers of tradition, they were still young adults trying to understand their place in a world larger than themselves. The final years before taking on full royal responsibilities formed a bridge between two identities, the child who had been shaped by distance and discipline, and the adult expected to embody dignity, continuity, and leadership. This transition was rarely smooth. Many heirs felt a quiet conflict between who they truly were and who they were expected to become. But they learned, slowly and inevitably, that the monarchy was not built on personal desire. It was built on the idea of service to history, to tradition, and to the millions of people who saw in the crown a symbol of stability. By the time they stepped fully into their public role, the distance from their parents that had defined their childhood no longer felt unusual. It felt like preparation. The long years lived under the care of nannies, tutors, and attendants had shaped them into something the monarchy relied on, a figure capable of standing alone, guided by discipline rather than emotion. Whether they embraced or resented this path was rarely visible to the public. What mattered was that they were ready. If you enjoy exploring the hidden stories of royal upbringing, forgotten traditions, and the secret history of Old Britain, make sure to subscribe to Old Britain Secrets and share your thoughts in the comments.